people think of parapsychology as having to do with channeling, aura reading, crystals, tarot cards, and popular psychic phenomenon. I don't think that it's often clear to the general public that scientific parapsychology is a full-blown scientific discipline.
Well, that's true. And of course, the problem is sustained by telephone books, for example, where if you look under the yellow pages for parapsychologists, what you find are psychic readers. And when you go further and you look into how the entertainment business has portrayed parapsychology and what even popular skeptical writers have written about parapsychology, what most people see if they're doing a quick survey is entertainment or bunk or something which is not science.
How would you characterize your work?
Well, actually, I don't really like the term parapsychology because it automatically pushes it outside the realm of a standard discipline with the use of the word para. So when people ask what I do, I often say that I'm a psychologist or I'm an engineer, because I'm both, and I study psychic phenomena. That's what I do. So since I've been trained in conventional disciplines, I'm using the tools of science to study these unusual effects. So scientific parapsychology is taking the tools of science and applying it to unusual phenomena, some of which may be thought of as psychic and some of which may not be.
The classical definitions of psychic phenomenon from a parapsychological point of view are basically extrasensory perception and psychokinesis.
That's right. And also precognition, and then there's some subclasses like out-of-body experiences, possibly, near-death experiences, possibly, possible survival of bodily death. All of those also fit under the category of scientific study of unusual events. And the events in these cases are what people talk about. So it's really a behavioral science.
Now, on either side of the scientific discipline, there are, I guess I would call them fringe groups. You have paranormal practitioners on the one hand who have all sorts of claims that they will make to promote their own practices. And on the other hand, you have the community of skeptics who are very vocal about saying, characteristically, there isn't a shred of evidence that any of this stuff is real. And your job, I guess, is to sort of walk the tightrope between these two.
Well, that's not a difficult tightrope to walk. I mean, the spectrum of opinion is so broad that on the one hand, the super enthusiasts, and on the other hand, the super skeptics are really very, very far apart. And there's a lot of room to walk in the middle. And I hope that most people are actually in the middle, that they haven't made up their mind one way or the other. As a scientist, it's actually quite easy to walk that middle road, because a scientist by nature is skeptical. The whole enterprise of science is skeptical. So I doubt what I study. I'm convinced by data at times, but I'm still doubtful. And in fact, you have to be, because as soon as you drop a certain level of skepticism about what you're doing, you're not really doing science anymore.
Well, I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that when you say you doubt, there are some things that have been so well established in the field of parapsychology that you've stopped doubting.
Well, that's true, but there's still a little piece of doubt. What we can say is that with extremely high levels of confidence, that certain phenomena exist.
Because I know scientific research and extrasensory perception goes back now over 100 years.
That's right.
And in your book, The Conscious Universe, you review hundreds and hundreds of published scientific experiments that have yielded positive data for extrasensory perception.
Right. So we can say, after reviewing all of this data, is it likely that telepathy exists? And the answer is yes, it's very, very likely. Is it absolutely 100% sure? No, because nothing in science is absolute. So we always leave open a small probability that we might be wrong. And it is necessary. It's almost it's a way of thinking about the phenomena that's necessary. But once you make a decision that there's a very low probability of being wrong, what it does is it shifts your focus from trying to prove the phenomena, we call that proof-oriented research, into process-oriented research, where we become more interested in what is actually going on here. And that's really where the shift lies. And so different scientists have different degrees of proof that they individually need in order to make that shift from proof-oriented into process-oriented research. For me, I think the proof issue is basically solved. There is proof. And so I'm more interested in process.
And of course, there's some scientists who will probably never be convinced.
That's clearly true. Some scientists will, and members of the general public as well, have such strong gut feelings about these phenomena where they feel that they're not true. There is, in essence, no amount of data, even personal experience, that will end up convincing them otherwise.
I think of it as, in some ways, a very healthy dialectic. In one respect, having a group of critics. I think parapsychology is probably the only science that has a professional group of opponents. It has in some ways sharpened the mental abilities and the quality of the research that parapsychologists do.
Well, that's absolutely true. In fact, that's demonstrably true. When you look at surveys of standard behavioral science and medical sciences and even the hard sciences like physics, the nature of the science and how carefully studies are done, parapsychology is always at the top of the methodological heap. And the reason for that is exactly what you just said, that after many, many decades of high scrutiny on every single nitpicking thing that you can imagine, anybody who cares to do parapsychology today as a scientist must know that, because they also know they'll be blown out of the water if they make a mistake. And that forces the methodology to be as tight as the textbooks say that ought to be.